Are migrant communities in our hometown a blessing or a curse? What does the Bible have to say about ministry to the foreigners among us? How do churches begin to reach out to migrant communities when they don't speak the language and have no idea about culture or customs? Welcome to World Methodist Evangelism's Real Faith, Real World podcast, where we connect the faith within us with the world around us. Our purpose at World Methodist Evangelism is to help people live more fully, share their faith, and impact their world. We do that by providing resources, events, and experiences that focus not only on inspiration and information, but also in implementation and impact. My name is Rob Haynes of World Methodist Evangelism. Today I'm joined on Zoom by Pastor Zach Samaria. He's a pastor of the Bridge Wesleyan Church in Logansport, Indiana, and is the National Director of Immigrant Connection. Be sure to stay with us after the interview as well. Zach has an offering for a special opportunity for churches to learn more about how they can connect with immigrant communities in their own towns. Immigrant Connections will be hosting a web conference on the 18th of August, 2020, and I will be sharing more information about that after our interview. This podcast is made possible through the generosity of Christ Church Global in Memphis, Tennessee, and we are grateful for their support. Would you do us a favor? Be sure to rate and subscribe. Your rating and subscription helps others know about this ministry opportunity. We also want your voice to be heard on a future episode of this podcast. How is your church or ministry meeting the needs in this COVID time? Maybe you've got a creative ministry where you're working to help people with food security or to find jobs or secure housing. How is your church or ministry leading in the work of racial justice? Let us know so that we may share it with others through a ministry moment on our future podcast. You can visit our website for instructions on how to submit your ministry moment. That's worldmethodist.org/podcast. Today's guest is Pastor Zach Samaria. He is a great friend and colleague to us at World Evangelism. He is a leader in both the local church and across the country in some vital ministries. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity that you all will have to learn so much from him. So here's Pastor Zach Samaria of the Bridge and National Director of Immigrant Connections.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here this morning.
You have been a part of the ministry of World Methodist Evangelism for a little while now and connected in with some of the work that we do through Order the Flame and that sort of thing. But help people get to know you a little bit. Tell us something about you.
Well, I'm a local church pastor, and I have learned in life that the more hats that you wear, the less you have to wear any one of those hats perfectly well. And so I'm a local church pastor. I went to seminary, but I have a master's in anthropology and missiology, served as a missionary, practice immigration law, run a community coffee shop, help with community development efforts. So I wear a lot of hats, but the primary one is probably local church pastor right now.
Great. And where do you live now, Zach? Tell everybody about that a little bit in your town.
I live in Logansport, Indiana, which I often joke is kind of the center of everywhere. And I am very proud of my little city. So I mean it, even though I say it facetiously a lot. But I understand that most people probably don't know where Logansport, Indiana is. And so it's a micropolitan area. And for those that don't know that term, it's a good one to learn. So the way that we set things up in the United States is there's metropolitan areas, there's micropolitan areas, and there's rural areas. Mm-hmm. And so micropolitan, we're not a part of a larger city. In fact, we're about an hour and a half away from Indianapolis, 2 hours or so away from Chicago, an hour from South Bend, Indiana. And so we're not like a bedroom community or suburban area, but we're not rural in the sense that while our city is only about 18,000, which makes it a small area, like all the surrounding 60 to 80,000 people in the surrounding counties come to our little city when they want to, go shopping or see a movie or go to restaurants. And so
Right.
in some ways we're kind of an area unto itself as opposed to latching on to another area.
Yeah. So I'm sure that influences the ministry in your church and some of the other ways that you reach in the community. You've been connected with the Wesleyan Church for a number of years, your whole life, maybe?
No, I wasn't raised a Wesleyan. In fact, I came by way. I was raised Primitive Methodist, which I don't know if anyone on the call would know that, but it's a really small denomination. In fact, more churches in Guatemala and Central America than the United States, but a holiness movement church. And then I went to Indiana Wesleyan University to do my undergrad. And it was at that time that I realized the Wesleyans were more than a movement, that there was actually a denomination.
Right.
People on this call, we're all part of the Wesleyan Methodist family.
Right.
There is a denomination that's also called the Wesleyan Church. And so I became a part of the Wesleyan Church during my time at Indiana Wesleyan, and then I served as a Wesleyan Church missionary before becoming ordained and then becoming a local church pastor.
That's really helpful. So you've had a variety of experiences in the Wesleyan Methodist family. So tell some of our podcast listeners, you're a leader not only in your community, but also in the Wesleyan Church and other denominations in ministry to migrant communities. Tell us about some of your work with migrant communities.
Yeah, so I didn't set out to serve and be kind of known as a leader in that world. It was just that I came to a church in Logansport, Indiana, and it was a declining, aging white church. And I was actually sent here by the district because their intention was to close the church. It had a great history. It had been open for over 100 years. And, I think it's great on the podcast to understand that the church continues on, capital C, but every local church was a church plant at one time, even though maybe where you're serving doesn't seem like a church plant. It was. There was a group in the community that felt a new church needed to form, and every church will die at some point or another. And so we had come here just to preach actually a couple weeks, because we didn't really want to be a part of that. We just wanted to fill in until someone else maybe could preach to the close.
Right.
But in the second week, we were here in Logansport. We went to dinner with a Latino family in the community and really sensed like God maybe wanted us to stay. And so I joke with some people that I'm 8 years in, but I'm still in my second week. No one's ever really officially hired me. We joked and said, "Hey, is the parsonage next to the church empty?" They said yes. We said, "Can we have a key?" And we got a key. And, a church that when we first came was about 15 people, and my leadership grew it down to only about 3 people, predating me now. So I grew it down, and then God resurrected it into life.
Wow.
And the way he did that was because we decided we would mirror our community. Like I said, Logansport is in kind of middle America. It's in Indiana. Like most small towns in Indiana, it was predominantly a Anglo town, a Caucasian white, whatever term you want to use. And so like 99+%. So we didn't even have a large African-American community. It was just a white rural community.
Right.
And then around the late 90s, early 2000s, IBP, a pork processing plant, got started here in Tyson. It's now a Tyson plant. And all of a sudden, our foreign-born population went from there not being anyone who was foreign-born in our community to now a third, like 1/3 of our community is foreign-born. And so drastic change for any community to feel. But on the call, you need to understand that like one of the changes with migration patterns throughout the world. So even if you're listening and you live, in Africa or Asia, is that it's not just that migration. It used to be that there were senders and receivers. So you left the rural area and came to an urban area,
right?
Or you left, Southern Africa and moved to Northern Africa. Or everyone came to the United States. That just isn't the case anymore. Global diaspora is from everywhere to everywhere, which means that even if you live in a small community like mine and think, oh, my community will never be diverse. Well, actually, it probably will be. A lot of diversity is occurring in small communities like Logansport, Indiana. So because there were so many foreign born here, and because we wanted to be a church that was multicultural and also were multilingual, we began building relationships with a lot of our immigrants and refugees in our community. And what we found early on was that the largest felt need of the foreign-born population in our community was access to legal services. You know, Rob, that like a lot of times when you're a pastor, you're kind of like the guide for your community. You realize that when people have needs, they call the local church, and the role of the pastor or the associate or the staff or the secretary is usually just to guide people to where to have those needs met. Like not every church is called to meet every need.
Right.
But hopefully you love your community and its people enough that you could say, well, we don't have a food pantry, Main Street Free Methodist Church does, go there. Or we might not have great like childcare, but First United Methodist has a great children's ministry, go there. So my assumption was when people said they had a need for immigration legal services, I would just say, well, there's this great, attorney or nonprofit that does that. And what I found was there wasn't, that most people were traveling, a couple hours to Chicago and spending a lot of money and sometimes not getting good help because sometimes it wasn't even really people who were legally able or authorized to practice immigration law. They were like notarios and a notario, not to get into the weeds too much, but in Central and South America, notario has legal standing, but in our country, it's like a notary public.
Okay.
And so in your community, if you see signs like on strip malls or at different like carnicerias or panaderias that say, notario publico, like they're using that confusing vernacular to act as if they're authorized to do immigration law, when the reality is they're not. And since it's so complex, even if they're good intentioned, a lot of times they do a lot more harm than good and hurt people's immigration pathways and charge a lot of money. Anyways, long story short, I'll fast forward. I love ideas. I joke with my friends. I have 100 ideas in a day, and my wife can sort through them all and find half of one that's decent. And so I came home and I said, Lindy, there's no one that's providing immigration legal services. There's a program through the Department of Justice that if you're a nonprofit and you would get training in immigration law, pass a bar to show competency in immigration law, and would get experience, that you could actually fill that gap and provide immigration legal services for your community. What do you think? Can I go do it? And we joke about it to this day. We don't know how this one slipped through, but Lindy said, sure, go ahead and do it. So I went to Baltimore, Maryland. I got training and experience. And now it's over 6 years ago, we launched one of the first church-based immigration legal services office in the whole country. Other nonprofits had done it, but churches hadn't really taken a hold of saying, what would it look like if a local church, not a separate nonprofit, but a local church did this themselves? And we did that 6 years ago, and that has kind of birthed of movements of other churches that we've been able to give experience to and help them launch their own immigration legal services offices through their church in their community, and big communities and small communities and everywhere in between.
That's a fascinating story. So many questions I want to ask. I want to back up to one thing first that you mentioned, and that was the term global diaspora. Explain that a little bit more. Do you mean that pastors, no matter where you live, likely have migrant communities in our own backyard, if you will, that need this kind of ministry?
Yeah. So the movement of people is really from everywhere to everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so no matter where they're listening from, like even if they view their country as one that a lot of people maybe in North America wouldn't even be able to find on a map, the reality is that there are people that have been born somewhere else that have moved there. If people don't follow this, and I mean, not everyone would, The reality is that 260 million people in the world are international migrants, which means that if you put all of them in one country, it would be the fifth most populous country on the globe. So this is impacting every single one, no matter where you live, rural, urban, no matter if you live in the global north, the global south, the global diaspora now is everywhere.
Okay, so you mentioned a minute ago the pastor as a guide to try to help people find things, but what I hear you say is that you're called to a local church to help them think about closing and become something much different. Shutting down and maybe starting something else, or those people would go to another church. But you have this huge change where you've seen something in the community. There's something more. Now you're going off to training and doing something that nobody else has done before, putting immigration and legal services in the local church. I think the foundational question to ask is, what do you see in the life and the teachings of Jesus that motivates you to that kind of work? And then we'll talk specifically about how that happened.
Yeah, so I think it's just important. Those that have been a part of the Order of the Flame family in recent years know Dave Smith, and Dave Smith is kind of like a spiritual dad to me, and he has helped me understand that like faithfulness to God is saying yes first. That real obedience is not saying, God, you tell me what to do, and then I'll determine whether to say yes or no. That delayed obedience that most of us move with and think is real obedience isn't real obedience. Real obedience is like yes right now, no matter what you're asking, I say yes first. Right. And what I have learned in my own life is that many times saying yes first leads us into blind spots that we didn't know existed. And so while I have served all over, I served in the South Pacific, I served in Southern Africa, I had gone on short-term mission trips in Latin America. And I remember when we were called to longer-term mission service, I actually said like anywhere but Latin America. And my best friends are all Latinos now, and they kind of cringe when I say that. But I mean, that's just honestly my story. I think growing up in the Midwest, I just had this perception about especially Latin American immigrants. And I think I had a pretty closed heart or a hard heart towards it.
Right.
And all of a sudden, instead of allowing the media or the political landscape to kind of shape my views on immigrants in the United States, I remember when I came to the bridge, it became very clear to me that the foreigner living among us, immigrants, the Hebrew word ger, like xenos in the New Testament, that in Scripture, this is not an issue that God does not speak about. In fact, on almost every page in Scripture, God is saying something related to how we care for, how we love, how we treat the most vulnerable, the most marginalized. I often tell people if God has favorites, he has a quartet, and it's the quartet of the oppressed. It's the widow, the orphan, the poor, and the foreigner living among us. And sometimes in English, and maybe if you're listening and you have another language that's your language of your heart, maybe you do the same thing where we translate foreigner living among us and say a stranger. And we define it in human terms to mean someone like me that I don't yet know. But Scripture is clear. Hospitality is not just about welcoming strangers like you. Hospitality is literally philoxenos, philo, love, xenos, foreigner, immigrants. We are called as leaders, not just as followers of Jesus, but as leaders for him. Every single time that Paul, that Peter, that the writer of Hebrews defines what someone called to lead the church should look like, there is always that word of hospitality in the list. And I became very, very, very cognizant of the fact that while I'm an extrovert and I love people like me, I don't know if 9, 10, 12 years ago, you would define me as someone who really was known by biblical hospitality. Yes, I hosted the Super Bowl party. Yes, I had my in-laws in the spare bedroom. And yes, that takes, a very powerful work of God in us. But the mark we're supposed to be distinguished as leaders who are following Jesus is hospitality, is how well we philoxenos, how well we love immigrants. Matthew 25 is very clear that as Jesus is separating the sheep and the goats, that a lot of it has to do with how well we tangibly love and serve and welcome the other, not just people like us, but also them. So all of that really pushed me. And the final thing I'll share that pushed me biblically is this idea of Samaria. I found that I had a gospel gap in my own life, that I loved leading and serving Jesus in the church in Jerusalem's Judea and the far parts. I was proud to be a missionary. I was proud to carry that badge of honor that, I've gone to the far parts. I've gone to places where there was no electricity or running water. I've done that. I've shown the Jesus film with unreached people groups and planted churches there. But I avoided Samaria at all costs. Much like the first century Jewish people, I found a way to bypass it. It made me uncomfortable. If anything, I talked about Samaria, but never had a relationship with the Samaritan. And so, the more I read, John 4 and other passages where Jesus chose to spend time, to go through, to talk to live in, to empower, to love, to welcome Samaritans, the more in my own life, I was realizing that I had groups of people, one of them being immigrants and the foreign born, that I avoided as I tried to serve God in the church. And the more I realized God calls us to Samaria, that many times the most receptive people are Samaritans. When you think about John 4, what's unique is the woman's testimony. I've met a man who's told me everything about myself should not be a testimony where you get lots of receptivity. And
Right.
Yet the Samaritans are ready. That's that harvest that you don't have to work for. A lot of times we work for a harvest within our own people group. But if we go to a Samaritan group, God has already been working and already has the harvest ready. That's what we found at our church. This church was resurrected and revitalized based on a harvest that I can honestly tell you, Rob, I had very little to do with other than getting a front row seat at the work of Jesus in my community. It wasn't a harvest I toiled at. It wasn't a harvest that I had to do a lot for. It was already there. We see the same thing with Philip, that, Philip is, because of the persecution in Jerusalem, is pushed to Samaria. And all of a sudden, there's this amazing harvest that occurs. And maybe Philip was extraordinarily gifted, or maybe Jesus is working in Samarias long before we arrive. And we arrive and just get to get a front row seat at a pretty amazing God-sized harvest.
So let's unpack that term Samaria just a minute. And I think what you're doing is referring to Jesus' call to serve in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the ends of the earth. So Samaria then is a place geographically, as you've been talking about it, nearby, but with people of a different maybe ethnicity of the person who goes to serve there. Is that a fair assessment of what what you mean there?
Yeah, and I think the key as you unpack that for yourself, for me, it's immigrants and foreign born, but it will look different to different people. It's who are those people that are avoided and bypassed and skipped over? You're not worried they're going to take from you, but they make you uncomfortable.
Right.
And so for some communities, it's it's the community of ex-cons, or maybe it's the single mothers, or teen pregnancy, or addiction, or mental illness. And so there's, I think, a lot of these things that are kind of created within different people in different communities. And we kind of all have our Samarias, the things that make us uncomfortable, the things to be avoided, the things that we try to kind of not think about, the out group, And so I think it's different to different people. I often, when I tell my story, share that while immigrants at one time in my life were my Samaria, now they're very much my Jerusalem. Like I want to spend, in fact, I would rather spend a whole day with immigrants than people that look like me most times.
Right.
And so, like, we always have to be cognizant that when we start loving Samaria, they become our family and friends. And then I'm always asking Jesus, okay, what's the next yes I have to say? Because there's another Samaria in my community that makes me uncomfortable and I'm avoiding. For me, that journey has been recovering addicts has been my next Samaria that I realized in my neighborhood. There's a lot of, addiction, and like, I don't want to think about it. When those people darken the threshold of my church, I don't get as comfortable and welcoming as I do with immigrants. And I've had Jesus kind of say, okay, will you love these people as well? Will you befriend them and welcome them in the same way that I gave you a heart transplant when it came to immigrants? What about this next Samaria? So some pastors out there who are listening, and ladies and church leaders, it's like you might think, oh, I'm good because, my own faith journey was there was a Samaria, and now, these are my friends and families and brothers and sisters. The question now is like, what's next? Because, I don't know if we ever get through a place in our life where we don't have some Samaria that God is still calling us to as he's working in and through us.
What an important reminder, because in your analysis there, all of us have a Samaria. No matter where we live, no matter who we are, there are people that are within arm's reach physically, though there may be a great chasm ethnically or some other sort of a barrier between us that God has called us to bridge, is what I hear you saying.
Yeah. And I would say just because you talk, talking is one thing, but being in relationship with is the real gauge. I think some of us are in positions where we talk a lot about issues, societal issues, and things like that. The question really is not, are you giving commentary on this? If you're a privileged person, it's easy to give commentary on things.
Right.
It's easy to take pictures of poor people when we're on mission trips, or to hold up signs saying we should care about the homeless. It's a lot more a Jesus thing, a kingdom thing, to actually build relationships with and interact with than just talk about.
Okay, so if someone's listening now and they say, Zach, I'm absolutely convinced, I know that there are people in my community that I need to show hospitality to, but I don't even know how to begin. I don't speak the language. They are right around me, but I don't even know anyone in that community, and I know that I have to do something. How do I start? I'm not a pastor, or maybe I am a pastor. How do you begin?
Yeah, so I would say I think that's one of the biggest gaps and one of the biggest questions that I'm asked. I was blessed when I talk about that second week I was here that a Latino family invited me to lunch. Mm-hmm. I will say I've learned that the most powerful location in any community is your table. The table is where change occurs. There was a reason why a lot of the rabbinical teaching in the first century said, better to eat, pork or pigs than Samaritan bread. Because the idea was, if you start, there's a lot of prohibitions in Judaism against like drinking the wine of a people or eating the bread of a people. Because it's like, if you start having meals and breaking bread with people, you're going to start building relationships with them. And if part of what you need to do is isolate yourself to keep yourself clean and holy, like there's going to be danger if the table is shared. And again in the Gospels, we see Jesus. He is eating and drinking with people. He is spending time at the table. So I would say the best first step you can do is find a way to share a table with someone who is foreign born. And what I have found is, even if there's language issues and that first meal I had, the second week I was in Logansport, that family didn't speak English. We didn't speak Spanish. In fact, just so we're all on the same page, even though I pastor a multilingual church, I'm monolingual. I only know English. I'm not fluent in Spanish.
Interesting.
And so if that's one of the excuses, let me just say that I think one of the reasons God has used the bridge is whatever excuse you have, God has already covered it, because he definitely chose the smallest, the least capable in choosing me and then choosing the bridge. And so whatever excuse you might have, let me just say that Jesus has already overcome it. So I just think inviting someone to the table, having a cup of coffee, maybe you're dropping your kids off at preschool and you notice that there, is another family that's new, and just saying like, hey, I'd love to learn your story. If you go to icwelcome.org, we have a table resource that you can do as a family or as a church or in a small group. And it has, you sit at a table together and you share food together. And there's some questions just about saying like, hey, what's your story? What brought you to this town? What do you love about where you came from? What do you love about where you're at now? Like, do you have some type, like, for instance, it was just, recently the Easter season, and my grandparents were immigrants from Poland and Slovakia. So every Good Friday we made pierogi, and like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pierogi. And so every Good Friday, like, that's part of my heritage. And so I can share the story of, here's a food that I love that my grandparents brought with them from their homeland. What's the food you love? And it's like, oh, we have the best carne asada, or we make chorizo from scratch, or my Burmese refugee friends will talk about like a different dish that they make. And so like, there's a whole toolkit you can use, like as a church, like if you want to take your leaders in your church or your small group, maybe meet with a Korean Methodist church down the road, or a Haitian church, and you can kind of just say, hey, let's learn together. But I guarantee you, no matter how kind of messy it is at the table, like trying to make it through languages and accents and stories, something special and powerful will happen at the table. And if you invite someone to the table, I almost guarantee that in most places around the world, they're going to invite you to their table. And the next thing you know, you've developed and birthed this beautiful relationship that has crossed cultural and linguistic lines. And from there, it usually grows into more and more and more. One person, then next thing you know, you're coming to their birthday parties, and this whole family group, and you've kind of been invited in. And so I think that's the first step. Invite someone to the table, whether it's a cup of coffee, whether it's a meal, whether it's doing like a community kind of potluck type thing. And then just ask questions and tell stories and learn. You'll learn two things. I find when I tell people this, you'll find that you have a shared narrative. In my own community, it's unique. We had a lot of railroads, and the canal came through. And so at one time, about 80 years ago, it was the Irish and the Italians that had the weird food that smelled and spoke the weird language. And so grandparents in my community have the same story as the Latino immigrants. And now the Burmese refugees that have moved here, we all at one time were kind of the outsider that has become the insider. And so as we start sharing these stories of what it's like coming, what it's like kind of finding our way in these new places, we find, oh my goodness, like, even though, I came at a different time, these are the stories my grandparents shared. Then you also learn the uniqueness, that there are things that are different. We have a large Korean population, and I always ask people, one of the things when I meet new immigrants is like, what's one thing, if I can give voice to one thing within the majority culture in this community, the white English speakers, what's one thing you wish we knew? And the Korean community always will say, we're not Korean. The Burmese community, like, Korean is a dialect. It's Burma. It's a completely different, it's in the same continent of Asia, but it's a completely different place. And they said, everyone thinks we're Korean, and we love Koreans, but we're not Korean. We're Korean. It's a whole different group. And so just, learning those unique nuances and the differences, I think is important as well. Learn the shared narrative, but then learn the things that make us unique and give voice to that when you get the chance. So eat, table, that's the summary.
Yes, and what an important reminder that all of us, when we trace our families back, were the outsider at one point. And so that is a commonality that we can begin with. and recognizing that even though we may at the current time be sitting in a position of privilege. And what a beautiful picture you reminded us of. The most powerful location in your community is the table. So, Zach, you reminded us that you started the first church-based immigration and legal services opportunity in the United States. And I want us to take a few minutes to talk about that. I remember when I was at the bridge not too long ago, you and I were sharing a cup of coffee, and your building is a nondescript building in an average street in town. And, the church is there, but in that, that narthex area, that gathering area, there's a coffee shop over in the corner. And what were the offices are now full of people coming and going for immigration help and that sort of thing. And your desk is now one of those coffee tables that where people are set up, for 2 or 3 friends to share a cup of coffee. So the pastor's office has been replaced by other work. So tell us a little bit about how someone who may be in a place like Logansport, in a different part of the country or a different part of the world, how can they get connected with resources and tools that you've mentioned?
Yeah, so first, I wasn't the first. I was one of the first. I think there was a church-based one in a Nazarene church in Iowa, and I think there was one in a church in Minnesota. We were one of the first 5 for sure.
Okay.
That was in a church. So we launched 6 years ago. Immigration is very complex, and so there's a lot of need. And so our little church, we're still not a large church by any means. We have served over 2,000 immigrant families from over 78 different nations. So if you're a church that supports missionaries around the world, definitely keep doing that. But realize you can impact the nations in a lot of different ways as the nations come to you. And so our church has, now we have 2 Department of Justice accredited legal representatives that help lots of different people. We help U.S. citizens who maybe, married an immigrant and they need to find paperwork. We help immigrants who already have status renew it. Sometimes we help immigrants who live here with a green card, but they want to have their children. Their children didn't get to come with them. And so we help reunite families. So there's lots of ways that we help and guide people through the immigration process. And so the reality is there are nowhere near enough immigration legal service providers anywhere in the country. So whether you live in a place like California or Texas or the East Coast, and you see immigrants all around you, and you would say, oh, there's definitely a need here, realize that even if you live, our next site that launches is going to be in a church plant in Garden City, Kansas, which is the far west of Kansas, literally in the middle of nowhere, hours away from any large city, and yet a large immigrant population that has nowhere else to turn. And so a church said, we want to welcome and serve immigrants in our area. And we not only want to plant a church, we also want to start an immigrant connection office. So there's a whole process to how you do that, how you assess. We love coaching people through it. While we are not the expert on this, we've been doing this for a long time and launching lots of church-based options. So while we're still learning, we are the guide that helps walk people through it. So icwelcome.org is a good place to start. That has a list of all of our Immigrant Connection legal offices. So if you have a friend who's an immigrant or a family member who's an immigrant that has questions, you can reach out to our closest Immigrant Connection office. Or even if there's not one near you, feel free to reach out to them and you can at least ask your question over the phone. And we can do our best to either guide you to a local place or see if we can help you from a distance. And if you're a church that wants to take first steps or next steps, that's what we do. We help you come up with whether it's a legal services office, whether it's maybe starting citizenship classes as a first step, whether it's doing a family resource night where you help foreign-born families with homework help and the parents with conversational English. Any of those welcoming activities, we love to coach people on, help connect with peers who can leverage that. And so just reach out at icwelcome.org. look at the resources. Feel free to contact us. I talk. In fact, today I talked to a pastor in Colorado. Yesterday I talked to one in Boston, and so like I'm on the phone with pastors quite often. I love to share what we've learned, not only in Logansport, but from a lot of other contexts. A lot of my heroes have done this throughout the nation. And so no matter what kind of church you are, big, small, in between, thinking you're going to close, just starting, already multicultural or want to become multicultural, even if you're an all-white church, just in a diverse area that wants to serve, we've worked with all kinds of churches. And so we realize everyone's first step and next step might be different, but we'll join you on the journey wherever you are to help you take your first step or next step.
Does that person have to be a pastor or a lawyer or a particular leader in the church, or is it open to other groups as well?
No, it's open to anyone. In fact, while a lot of the first people who started like me were ordained ministers who were kind of in smaller churches, so multi-vocational to begin with, and we decided what better to be a pastor and a legal rep, every single one of them, as their site grew, had to find someone else, a key lay leader, to also become accredited and help, because the need is great. And when you're still a pastor and still pastoring a church, you can give some time to it, but like you can't give all the time it'll probably need. So if you're a lay person in the church, for sure, we train up a lot of lay leaders. In fact, in our network, I would think that now at least 2/3 of our accredited reps, maybe even more, aren't pastors, but are just lay leaders who are serving the church and the community in this way. So,
wow, Zach, so much information, so helpful, and great teaching about a Christian response to communities right within our arm's reach. Let me ask you a question. How has this work impacted your own discipleship? How has this formed your own Christian understanding?
Yeah, and it seems selfish, and it maybe is, but I would do this all over again just because it's made me so much more like Jesus. While I'm proud to have a front row seat of seeing 2,000 plus immigrant families receive help and know that like we were a part of that, the reality is those 2,000 plus immigrant families have impacted my life far more than I've impacted theirs. I've learned so much about the heart of Jesus. I've learned so much about what the kingdom looks like, what justice looks like. I get to practice for eternity every single day because I get to befriend and learn from and love and welcome and be formed by immigrants. And so I'll never be the same because of it. I think that's the story of, I think, most people who start kind of living out, Matthew 25, living out, loving the quartet of the oppressed and vulnerable. The more time we spend there, the more time we get to spend with Jesus. And I'm forever different because of it. So,
Zach Samaria, pastor of the Bridge in Logansport, Indiana, and leader in Immigrant Connection. Zach, my friend, thank you so much for your heart and your message today.
Can I plug one final thing, Rob, before we sign off?
Yes, and please let us know how people can get in touch with you.
Yeah, so August 18th of 2020, if you're listening to this before that, Immigrant Connection is hosting a free web conference. And so it'll go from 1:30 to 4:30 Eastern Standard Time. So wherever you are, it'll be a live web conference. It's free. You can join from anywhere. If at that time you can join with the people in your home or with your church staff or just by yourself, whatever works. We're going to share the story of lots of different churches of all shapes and sizes and lots of different places and how they're taking their first and next step. So it'll be kind of an empowering time to kind of learn some innovative ways to love and serve immigrants in your community. And so if you go to icwelcome.org, you'll see Welcome 2020 on that website. You can click there and register, and we'll give you the information. But you'll hear from, it'll probably be, at least, 10 or so different lay people and church leaders and pastors who are all loving and serving immigrants in different ways and in different places. And hopefully it'll kind of spur your kingdom imagination in your own area of some things you can do if God is calling you to love your community, probably as it's changing and becoming more diverse and more immigrants maybe moving there. So love for you to take part in that. That's August 18th, 2020. It's a Tuesday in the afternoon. You can register for free and kind of learn some new ways that you can be involved in that. And if you go to that website, icwelcome.org, there's other resources there that you can take a hold of. A lot of great things you can do as an individual, as a small group, as a church, as a family, to practice biblical hospitality in your own life.
The most powerful location in our community might very well be right around the table. Wow, what an important lesson. My thanks again to Zach for his teaching, for his insight, for his wisdom. If you want to learn more about Immigrant Connection and how you might be involved, there's a web conference on Tuesday, August 18th, 2020. It will be at 1:30 Eastern Time. You can visit icwelcome.org/welcome for more information. This is in our show notes, as well as the Facebook link to the event. The website again, icwelcome.org/welcome for information and registration. Our thanks again to Christchurch Global for sponsoring this episode. Be sure to rate and subscribe, and thank you for listening. I'm Rob Haynes of World Methodist Evangelism's Real Faith, Real World podcast.